On a cold February morning in 2005, in a small logging town pressed against the moss-covered mountains of the Pacific Northwest, a woman named Sarah Brennan disappeared. She was 28 years old, a mother of two, a part-time librarian with freckles across her nose and a habit of humming while she worked. Her car was found idling in the driveway of her home, driver's door open, purse still on the passenger seat, keys in the ignition. The house was quiet. The children were at school, and Sarah Brennan was gone. For 17 years, the question hung in the damp air of that town like fog that never quite lifts. What happened to Sarah Brennan? The town of Crescent Bay sits at the edge of the Olympic Peninsula, where the evergreens grow so thick the sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. Population 3,200, give or take, depending on the season and the work. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, your business, your family history going back 3 generations. The mill had closed in the 90s, leaving behind a skeleton crew at the smaller timber operations and a main street dotted with empty storefronts. The air always smelled of cedar and salt water. The mountains rose up behind the town like silent witnesses, their peaks hidden in clouds most of the year. Sarah Brennan had grown up there. Born Sarah Mitchell, she'd graduated from Crescent Bay High School in 1995, married Robert Brennan 2 years later in a small ceremony at the Presbyterian Church on Maple Street. They had 2 children, Emma, born in 1999, and Jacob, born in 2002. The family lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Pine Ridge Road, a winding street that climbed up from the town center into the hills. The house had blue siding and white trim. A wooden swing hung from the big Douglas fir in the backyard. Sarah worked 3 days a week at the town library, shelving books and helping elderly residents with the new computer system. Robert worked at Hanson Timber, operating heavy machinery, coming home most evenings with sawdust in his hair and diesel fuel on his hands. Those who knew them said they seemed like any other young family trying to make it work. Sarah volunteered at the elementary school. Robert coached Little League in the summer. They attended church most Sundays. They paid their bills on time. They kept their yard neat. February 14, 2005 was a Tuesday, Valentine's Day. The morning broke gray and cold, temperature hovering just above freezing, a light rain misting down from clouds that seemed to sit right on top of the trees. Sarah had gotten up at 6:30, same as always. She'd made breakfast for the children, oatmeal with brown sugar for Emma, toast with jam for Jacob. Robert had already left for work, his shift starting at 6. The routine was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of morning that happens 1,000 times in 1,000 small towns. Sarah had dressed in jeans and a green sweater. She'd pulled her auburn hair back in a ponytail. She'd walked the children to the bus stop at the end of Pine Ridge Road at 7:45, stood with them in the drizzle until the yellow bus came rattling up the hill. Emma had hugged her goodbye. Jacob had waved from the window. The bus driver, a woman named Margaret Chen who'd been driving that route for 12 years, later told investigators that Sarah had smiled and waved back, then turned and walked up the hill toward home. That was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Brennan alive. At approximately 8:15 that morning, a neighbor named Douglas Pritchard was leaving for work when he noticed Sarah's car, a 1998 Honda Civic, dark green, idling in her driveway. The driver's door was open. The engine was running. He thought it was odd but not alarming. He assumed she was running back inside for something she'd forgotten. He drove past. When he returned home for lunch at noon, the car was still there, still idling, still with the door open. Douglas Pritchard called the sheriff's office at 12:07 p.m. Deputy Michael Torres arrived at 12:19. He found the scene exactly as Pritchard had described. The car was running, had been running for hours. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank. The purse was on the passenger seat, wallet inside with $43 in cash and all of Sarah's credit cards. Her cell phone was in the cup holder. The keys were in the ignition. There was a grocery list on the dashboard in Sarah's handwriting. Milk, eggs, chicken, laundry detergent. Deputy Torres approached the house. The front door was unlocked. He called out. No answer. He entered, one hand on his service weapon. The house was quiet. Dishes from breakfast were still in the sink. A load of laundry sat wet in the washing machine. The television in the living room was on, tuned to a morning talk show, volume low. In the bedroom, the bed was made. Sarah's jacket hung on a hook by the door. Her boots were lined up on the mat. There was no sign of struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no blood. Nothing appeared to be missing except Sarah herself. Clear's throat. Within an hour, the Crescent Bay Volunteer Fire Department had mobilized a search team. Sheriff's deputies from Jefferson County arrived by 1:30. The rain had picked up, steady now, cold. They started in the immediate vicinity of the house, working outward in expanding circles. Volunteers combed through the woods behind Pine Ridge Road, calling Sarah's name into the dripping silence of the forest. Search dogs were brought in from Port Townsend, German shepherds trained in tracking, their handlers watching as the dogs circled the driveway, noses to the wet pavement, then sat down, confused. The scent trail went nowhere. Robert Brennan was contacted at the timber yard at 1:45 p.m. He arrived home at 2:10, pale and shaking. Deputies watched him carefully. He stood in the driveway staring at Sarah's car and said, I don't understand what happened. His voice was hoarse. His hands were trembling. Those who knew him said Robert seemed genuinely shocked. By evening, over 100 volunteers had joined the search. The community center opened its doors, became an informal command post. Coffee was brewed in industrial-sized urns. Maps were spread across folding tables. The local radio station broadcast updates every hour. Sarah's parents, Frank and Linda Mitchell, drove up from Olympia, arriving just after dark. Linda Mitchell collapsed in the driveway, had to be helped inside by neighbors. The search continued through the night, flashlight beams sweeping through the trees, voices calling out against the rain. They searched the ravines, the old logging roads, the creek beds. They searched the beach where the town met the sound, walked the shoreline looking for footprints, for any sign. They found nothing. February 15th dawned cold and gray. The search expanded. Helicopter from the Coast Guard flew grid patterns over the forest. Dive teams checked the deeper parts of Crescent Creek. Investigators began interviewing neighbors, friends, coworkers, anyone who'd seen Sarah in the days before she vanished. A picture began to emerge, pieced together from small statements, casual observations. Sarah had seemed distracted lately, quieter than usual. Her friend Jennifer Walsh, who worked with her at the library, said Sarah had lost weight over the past few months. She'd been picking at her lunch, staring out the window. When Jennifer asked if everything was okay, Sarah had smiled and said, "Just tired. The kids, you know." Another friend, Michelle Cortez, mentioned that Sarah had asked her, about a week before she disappeared, if Michelle knew any good divorce lawyers. "Not for me," Sarah had said quickly, "for a friend. Someone I know needs help." Robert Brennan's coworkers at Hanson Timber told investigators that Robert had seemed normal, nothing unusual. He'd been complaining about money, sure, but everyone complained about money. The mill work wasn't steady. Hours got cut. Bills piled up. Robert had mentioned picking up weekend shifts if they were available. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the statistics. In missing person cases involving married women, the spouse was always the first person to scrutinize. But Robert had an alibi. He'd clocked in at Hanson Timber at 5:58 a.m. on February 14th and hadn't left until after the sheriff's office called him at 1:45 p.m. 12 witnesses could confirm it. The foreman had seen him. His crew had worked alongside him all morning. Robert Brennan had been 12 miles away, operating a log loader when his wife disappeared. Still, something didn't sit right. Investigators noticed small things. Robert's demeanor, the way he spoke about Sarah in past tense from the very beginning. She was a good mother, he'd say. She loved the kids. Not she is, but she was. When asked about their marriage, Robert's jaw tightened. We had our problems, he said. What couple doesn't? When pressed, he admitted they'd been arguing lately. Money, stress. The usual things. On February 16th, forensic teams examined Sarah's car in detail. They found her fingerprints on the steering wheel, the door handle, the gear shift. They found Robert's prints too, which made sense. He drove the car sometimes. They found nothing unusual in the trunk. No blood, no hair, no fibers that shouldn't be there. The car was clean. Too clean, one investigator noted. A family car with 2 young children should have more debris. No crumbs, no forgotten toys, no juice box stains. It had been recently vacuumed. Phone records showed that Sarah's cell phone had last pinged a tower at 7:52 a.m. on February 14th, consistent with her being at home. There were no calls made after that, no texts. The phone had simply gone silent. Bank records showed no unusual activity, no large withdrawals, no secret accounts. Sarah's credit cards hadn't been used since February 13th, when she'd bought groceries at the Safeway in town. $26.34. The investigation interviewed everyone on Pine Ridge Road. Most people had been at work or inside their homes that morning. No one had seen anything unusual. No strange vehicles. No unfamiliar people. Douglas Pritchard, the neighbor who'd first reported the idling car, said he'd been home all morning until 8:10 when he left for his job at the hardware store. He hadn't heard anything unusual. No screams, no sounds of struggle. But there was one detail that caught investigators' attention. Clear's throat. Pritchard mentioned that he'd seen Robert Brennan's truck drive past the house around 7:30 that morning. I thought it was odd, Pritchard said, because Robert usually leaves by 6 for work. I figured maybe he forgot something. Investigators asked Robert about this. Robert said Pritchard must have been mistaken. He'd left for work at 5:30, same as always. He'd clocked in at 6. The time cards proved it, except the time cards only showed when someone clocked in, not when they actually arrived at the work site. Hanson Timber was 12 miles from Crescent Bay, a 20-minute drive on a good day. If Robert left home at 5:30, he should have arrived at work around 5:50. But he hadn't clocked in until 5:58. Deputies checked the odometer reading on Robert's truck, a 2001 Ford F-150. They checked it against the reading from his last oil change 2 weeks earlier. The math didn't quite add up. There were 40 extra miles unaccounted for. Robert said he'd driven to Port Townsend over the weekend to pick up supplies. Maybe he'd forgotten to mention it. Maybe the odometer was wrong. Maybe. By the end of February, the active search had wound down. The volunteers went home. The helicopters stopped flying. The dive teams packed up their gear. Sarah Brennan's face was on missing person posters stapled to telephone poles throughout Jefferson County. The case remained open, but leads had dried up. There was no body, no witnesses. No evidence of foul play beyond the troubling circumstance of her car idling in the driveway with no sign of Sarah herself. Detectives continued to investigate quietly. They looked at Robert Brennan's background. Clean record. No history of domestic violence. Neighbors described him as quiet, hardworking, maybe a little distant. His family stood by him. His parents told anyone who would listen that their son would never hurt Sarah, that he loved her, that he was devastated. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt that cold whisper of suspicion in the back of your mind, you know how it feels to be caught between loyalty and truth. The community of Crescent Bay was divided. Some believed Robert was innocent, a grieving husband being unfairly scrutinized. Others whispered behind closed doors that something was wrong, that his story didn't add up, that his eyes were too dry at Sarah's vigils. Spring came. The rain continued. The case went cold. In June of 2005, Robert Brennan put the house on Pine Ridge Road up for sale. He said the memories were too painful. He said the children needed a fresh start. He moved with Emma and Jacob to a rental house in Port Townsend, 25 miles away. He changed jobs, started working at a marina fixing boat engines. The house on Pine Ridge Road sat empty for 8 months before it finally sold. Life went on the way it does after tragedy. The community moved forward. Other news filled the local paper. But for Frank and Linda Mitchell, Sarah's parents, time had stopped on that February morning. They visited Crescent Bay every month, put fresh flowers at the base of the Douglas fir where Sarah's children used to play. They kept Sarah's missing person case in the public eye, gave interviews to local television stations on the anniversary of her disappearance, begged anyone with information to come forward. Robert Brennan rarely spoke to them. The relationship had fractured. Linda Mitchell later told investigators that Robert had become hostile toward them, accused them of spreading rumors about him, told them to leave him and the children alone. When they asked to see Emma and Jacob, Robert made excuses. The kids were busy. They were adjusting. They needed space. In 2007, 2 years after Sarah vanished, Robert remarried. Her name was Catherine Hale, a woman he'd met at the marina where he worked. She was 31, divorced, no children. Those who knew them said Robert seemed happier, lighter. The wedding was small, quiet, held at a courthouse with just a few witnesses. Emma and Jacob called her Kathy. The years passed, 2008, 2009, 2010. Emma grew into a teenager, quiet and withdrawn, her mother's auburn hair and her father's sharp jawline. Jacob became a boy who drew pictures constantly, filling notebooks with sketches of forests and empty houses and cars with open doors. Teachers noticed he had nightmares. School counselors asked careful questions. Jacob always said the same thing: "I'm fine. Just bad dreams." For those who work with traumatized children, there are signs that can't be ignored, behaviors that speak louder than words. Jacob wet the bed until he was 11. He had panic attacks when anyone raised their voice. He flinched when doors slammed, and he never, ever talked about his mother. Robert and Catherine's marriage began to show cracks by 2012. Neighbors in Port Townsend reported hearing arguments late at night. Catherine confided to a coworker that Robert had a temper, that he scared her sometimes, that he'd punch walls when he got angry. In 2014, Catherine filed for divorce. She moved out. In the court documents, she cited irreconcilable differences. She didn't elaborate, but she did tell one person the truth. Her sister, Amanda Hale, later testified that Catherine had said, "There's something wrong with him, something broken. He doesn't feel things the way normal people do, and those kids, they're terrified of him, especially Emma." In 2016, 11 years after Sarah Brennan disappeared, Emma Brennan turned 17. She'd been accepted to the University of Washington in Seattle. She'd be leaving home in the fall. Her grandmother, Linda Mitchell, still called her every week, maintained that fragile connection. In July, during one of those calls, Linda asked Emma if she was excited about college. Emma had been quiet for a long moment. Then she'd said, "Grandma, can I tell you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. I need to tell someone. I've needed to tell someone for so long." Clear's throat, Linda Mitchell held her breath. "It's about Mom," Emma said. Her voice was shaking. "It's about what happened to Mom. I think I know what Dad did." On August 3, 2016, Detective Sarah Chen of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office received a phone call from Linda Mitchell. Mrs. Mitchell explained that her granddaughter had something to tell authorities about Sarah Brennan's disappearance. Detective Chen, who'd inherited the cold case 3 years earlier and had reviewed the files dozens of times, arranged to meet with Emma Brennan. The interview took place on August 5 at the sheriff's office in Port Townsend. Emma came with her grandmother and a victim's advocate. She was tall and thin, with anxious eyes. She twisted a tissue in her hands while she spoke. Detective Chen recorded the entire interview. The transcript runs 47 pages. Emma said she'd been 6 years old when her mother disappeared. She remembered that morning. She remembered the bus ride to school. She remembered coming home that afternoon and finding police cars in the driveway. She remembered her father's face, pale and blank. She remembered the weeks of searching, the questions, the whispers. But there was something else she remembered, something she'd been too young to understand at the time, something that had surfaced in fragments over the years, in dreams and sudden memories that hit her like cold water. She remembered waking up early on Valentine's Day morning before dawn. She'd heard voices downstairs, her parents arguing, not loud but tense, whispered and sharp. She'd gotten out of bed, crept to the top of the stairs. "I saw them," Emma told Detective Chen. "They were in the living room. Dad had Mom's arm. He was holding it tight. Mom was crying. She said, 'You're hurting me.' Dad said, 'Just tell me the truth.' Mom said, 'There's nothing to tell. I want a divorce, Robert, that's all. I just want out.'" Emma had gone back to bed, frightened. She'd pretended to be asleep when her father came in later to wake her and Jacob for school. But there was more. Emma said she remembered her father leaving for work that morning. She'd watched from her bedroom window. It was still dark. She'd seen the taillights of his truck disappear down Pine Ridge Road. But then, maybe 30 minutes later, she'd seen the truck come back. She'd seen her father get out, walk into the house. She'd heard him downstairs. She'd heard her mother's voice, surprised. "What are you doing back?" Emma had been scared. She'd stayed in her room with Jacob. They'd listened to the sounds downstairs. Footsteps, a door closing, the garage door opening and closing, the truck starting again, pulling away. When their father had come back later to get them ready for school, he'd acted like nothing had happened. He'd smiled. He'd made them breakfast. He'd walked them to the bus stop. Detective Chen asked Emma why she hadn't told anyone this before. Emma started to cry. "I was 6, she said. "I didn't understand. And Dad, after Mom was gone, he told us we had to be strong. He said if we talked about that day, it would hurt the investigation. He said people would ask us terrible questions. He said we had to protect the family." Over the next weeks, Detective Chen interviewed Jacob Brennan, now 14. Jacob's memories were hazier. He'd been only 3 when Sarah disappeared. But he remembered things too, strange things. His father burning something in the backyard fire pit a few days after their mother vanished. His father scrubbing out the bed of his truck late one night, using bleach, the smell so strong it made Jacob's eyes water. His father's mood swings, the sudden rages, the cold silences. Jacob also remembered something else. Years later, when he was maybe 8 or 9, he'd been playing in the garage and found a box hidden behind some old paint cans. Inside was his mother's wedding ring, her watch, and a necklace she always wore, a small silver heart on a chain. Items that should have been on Sarah's body when she disappeared. Items that weren't in her purse, weren't in the house. Items his father shouldn't have had. Jacob had put the box back, terrified. He'd never mentioned it to anyone. On September 20th, 2016, Jefferson County Sheriff's Department officially reopened the investigation into Sarah Brennan's disappearance. Detective Chen assembled a task force. They began with Robert Brennan's timeline on February 14, 2005. They found the time card records from Hanson Timber. Robert had clocked in at 5:58 a.m. But investigators now obtained security camera footage from a gas station on Highway 20, halfway between Crescent Bay and Port Townsend. The footage from February 14, 2005, showed Robert Brennan's truck pulling in at 7:43 a.m. Robert got out, pumped gas, went inside to pay. He was wearing different clothes than he'd had on when he left for work earlier. A different jacket, different boots. The timeline collapsed. If Robert left home at 5:30 and arrived at work at 5:58, he couldn't have been at that gas station at 7:43, unless he'd left work, driven back toward Crescent Bay, and then returned to work later. But he'd been seen at the timber yard all morning. His coworkers confirmed it, except his coworkers confirmed seeing him after 8 a.m. No one could specifically place him at the yard between 6 and 8. There was a gap, 2 hours. Enough time to drive home, enough time to do something terrible, enough time to drive back. Investigators re-examined Robert's truck. It had been sold years ago, but they tracked it down through vehicle registration records. The current owner had kept it in good condition. Forensic teams ripped out the bed liner, examined every surface with luminol. They found traces of blood, old blood degraded but there, in the bed of the truck, along the edges, in the seams. DNA testing took months. The results came back in February 2017. The blood was Sarah Brennan's. On March 7, 2017, Detective Chen obtained a search warrant for the property on Pine Ridge Road where the Brennans had lived. New owners had renovated extensively, but the land around the house was largely untouched. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They alerted in 2 locations: the crawl space under the house and a section of forest about 200 yards behind the property line. Ground-penetrating radar showed a disturbance in the soil in the forest, a depression about 6 feet long, 3 feet deep. Excavation began on March 10th. They found her on March 12th. Sarah Brennan was buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in a blue tarp. After 12 years in the ground, she was barely recognizable, but dental records confirmed her identity. The medical examiner determined cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. Her neck had been broken. The wedding ring, the watch, the silver necklace, all were still in the box hidden in Robert Brennan's garage at his current residence. A search warrant executed on March 15th recovered them, along with other evidence. Journals belonging to Sarah, entries from late 2004 and early 2005, documenting Robert's increasing jealousy and controlling behavior. She'd written that she was afraid of him. She'd written that she'd asked for a divorce and he'd told her, "If you try to leave me, you'll regret it." On March 16th, 2017, Robert Brennan was arrested at his home in Port Townsend. He was charged with first-degree murder. Bail was denied. Detectives watched him carefully as they read him his rights. Robert Brennan said nothing. His face was blank. His hands were steady. Those who believe in justice delayed say that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it. The trial began in October 2017. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The blood in the truck, the hidden jewelry, Sarah's journals, the timeline inconsistencies, and most damning of all, the testimony of Emma and Jacob Brennan. Emma took the stand on October 24th. She was 18 now, a freshman at UW. She wore a black dress and her mother's silver heart necklace, recovered from evidence. She looked directly at her father as she described what she remembered from that February morning. Robert Brennan stared at the table in front of him. Jacob testified the next day. He was 15, his voice still cracking with adolescence. He described finding his mother's belongings hidden in the garage. He described his father's rages. He said, "I always knew, I just couldn't prove it, and I was too scared to say anything." The defense argued that the case was circumstantial, that Emma's memories were unreliable after so many years, that the blood in the truck could have come from any number of innocuous incidents, that the journals were taken out of context, that Robert Brennan was a grieving widower being railroaded by a community desperate to solve an old crime. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. On November 2, 2017, they returned a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Robert Brennan showed no reaction. In the gallery, Linda and Frank Mitchell held each other and wept. Emma and Jacob sat with their grandmother, their faces pale and exhausted. At sentencing in January 2018, the judge called the crime particularly heinous, noting that Robert Brennan had not only killed his wife but had spent 12 years maintaining the lie, forcing his children to live with a murderer, denying Sarah's parents closure. Robert Brennan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never confessed. He never showed remorse. To this day, he maintains his innocence from his cell at the Washington State Penitentiary. But the truth came out anyway. Slowly, painfully, through the courage of 2 children who carried an impossible burden for most of their lives. through the dedication of investigators who refused to let a cold case stay cold, through small details, a gas station camera, a scrap of blood, a box hidden in the dark, that proved that secrets, no matter how deep you bury them, have a way of rising to the surface. Sarah Brennan was 38 years old when she died. She never saw her children grow up. She never got to leave the marriage that terrified her, but she is not forgotten. Her children carry her memory. Her parents tend her grave in the small cemetery outside Crescent Bay, under the shadow of those ancient Douglas firs. And on quiet mornings, when the fog rolls in from the sound and the forest drips with rain, some say you can still feel her presence in that town. A reminder that the truth matters, that justice matters, that every life lost deserves to be remembered. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.